Before that time.
That's the physics behind, for example,
another question.
people's reaction, the actual change in mass.
Over
the course of 7 years, the book was put together.
Welcome to the Scholar's Chair. It was Aristotle in his writings on ethics who said, "It is our choice of good or evil that determines our character, not our opinions about good or evil. It is indeed knowledge or lack of that determines the quality of our lives." Tonight, a conversation with Dr. Timothy B. Noone from Catholic University of America School of Philosophy. At Focus, what is epistemology? What is its relevance, the study of this philosophy, and why distinguish between knowledge and opinion? Tonight, a conversation about the nature and scope of knowledge right here in the Scholar's Chair.
Let the conditions of inequality that we suffered under, when we are the oppressor, the dominant class, let's not impose that injustice on the others.
Anybody think that you could have a just system without giving women their rights?
Everyone has an opinion, and we sit around the marketplace and talk about opinion, but what is truth?
With the shareholder, their goal is similar to the business, to maximize profit.
That belief becomes a context for a development of knowledge.
Say physics is the DNA of technology because the rules for how you build new technology starts in physics.
Because Quran challenges the people. It's not only the people of the book, it challenges Muslims.
We say secular, they hear godless.
Right.
What was intended?
Watch the Scholar's Chair every Monday night. And here is your host. Welcome to the Scholar's Chair, Professor Noone.
Thank you.
I wanted
Glad
to, good.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you, where did you get your PhD from?
The University of Toronto.
Ah,
Yeah.
and what was your paper on?
It was on a Franciscan philosopher of the middle of the 13th century named Richard Rufus, believe it or not.
Did you sell books?
No. I published a lot of articles out of it. I edited a work that had never been published.
How long have you been with the Catholic University?
I've been there for 20 years, 21 years, yeah.
Wow, we should get the answers right. I picked out a definition for a topic, epistemology, and it says it is the study of the nature and scope of knowledge and justified belief. It analyzes the nature of knowledge and how it relates to similar notions such as truth, belief, justification. Is that a working definition, or do you want to expand on it?
Well, I could expand on it. As I think I told you, I tend to rely on more on the ancient and the medieval understanding of these things, but these are all the terms that are related in contemporary thought. Epistemology endeavors to account for what knowledge is by distinguishing belief, understood more or less as cognition, from knowing in the strict sense, and it does so by claiming that a proposition to be known has to be true. The person who holds that proposition or entertains that proposition has to believe it. And then in addition to those two factors, there has to be justification. So that is some kind of account of why that belief is true or should be thought to be true.
I see.
Yeah.
What is knowledge in your view?
Knowledge, in my view, shouldn't, and the analysis of knowledge should begin with observing that cognitive agents are different from non-cognitive agents. Say a squirrel or a frog is different from a rock, and then understand human cognition and both of its modes, sense and intellect, as differing from, but nonetheless somewhat continuous with the lower cognitive agents, the lower animals. Right?
So you would describe the study of this, as we talked about human identity, you would describe that creature as a rational creature.
Rational animal, right? Yeah. So I would if you go to someone like Aristotle, for example, or even Plato, their notion is that cognition is the category. It's a way of being for them that makes things like frogs and dogs and humans differ from non-cognitive entities like plants and rocks. And then to see human cognitive achievement against that background, determining and trying to articulate what we have in common in terms of cognitive performance with lower animals, and what it is that's distinctive, right? That's
that's what makes us different.
Right, and so whereas much of modern epistemology is rooted in a Cartesian background, and in Descartes' way of looking at it, only humans, properly speaking, have cognition. Only humans are conscious, right? Which is a very different position, right? Obviously, because he would have understood even some of the higher mammalia as being very complicated mechanisms, but not really having genuine cognition.
How is knowledge acquired by humans?
It depends on which mode you're talking about. Sense knowledge, obviously, by the exercise of external senses.
I do know we have to kind of narrow it down, so I guess I will be talking primarily in the area of
intellectual knowledge?
Proposition knowledge or proposition.
Right, that's what the modern epistemology wants to start with. The proposition is the unit, right? If you want, that's the building block.
Yes.
And then the idea is that you have a proposition's P, Khalil is here. It's usually a very low-level kind of knowledge, not like the internal angles of a Euclidean triangle are equal to 180 degrees. It's not something or all humans are political animals or anything like that. It's very low level. And then the idea is I have a proposition, I'm aware of that proposition, and I'm justified in believing it if it's a case, is the common way to go at it, and say, I'm justified in believing it. If I'm justified in believing it, then it's going to be knowledge. And then the question becomes, what's the criterion for saying it's justified belief?
Yes.
And then there are two camps here. Fundamentally, there are those who say you're justified in believing this because the evidence of Khalil being here is right in front of you. Right?
It's a fact.
Right, it's a fact. Right. And the idea is that the evidence, the psychological state, in other words, of evidence that causes me to assent to it, and I have to assent because of the evidence being so, if you want, manifest. The other position is that of the reliabilists who say, no, it's not real. The justification is not properly the evidence, though they don't doubt that some kind of evidence or some kind of psychological state is present in your mind. What they claim is rather what makes it justified is that the causal process that leads to that belief is a reliable causal process.
And that would be, for example?
My senses are reliable for the most part, so it's a causal process, and since those are the means for acquiring and maintaining or entertaining that belief, that's why they think then that belief is justified, and that hence it's knowledge. Right?
There was a question posed to me before coming on the program that said, why is it that we talk about justifiable belief rather than justifiable truth or justified truth?
Right. Well, truth, there are three theories of truth in contemporary philosophy, right? One of the more ancient ones, of course, is correspondent. So in other words, the idea is that if I say S is P, that's true because it corresponds to S being P out there in the world, some kind of correspondence. Another view is that proposition isn't true taken in isolation, but is true because it's coherent with all other propositions entertained by the community or by the individual. Here, people vary on what they're going to appeal to, but the idea is that there's a kind of web of belief, and then knowledge is this build up of like a spider's web, right? So what makes it true is that it coheres with everything else we know, right? And then, of course, William James very famously held that no, neither one of those is correct entirely, but rather they're not entirely incorrect either, but rather it's the case, according to William James, that a belief is true just in case it can be acted upon or make some difference in the world, and this calls the famous pragmatic. So you have the three theories: correspondence, coherence is the second one, and then pragmatic theories of truth.
Interesting.
Yeah. So that's the idea. But in the standard analysis, as it's called, there couldn't be such a thing as false knowledge, and you couldn't either have a case where you had knowledge without belief. Right, in other words, belief
so
is
you have to believe in the truth.
Right, you have to believe in the proposition for it to be known.
Gotcha.
Right.
Gotcha. Right. The idea of limitations to knowledge is also springing up at me, but I want to start with what can people know?
Yeah, well, I mean, they can know many things, both according to contemporary epistemology and according to the more ancient medieval take on it. According to contemporary epistemology, you can know ordinary beliefs like you're sitting here, I'm sitting here, we're having a conversation about epistemology. Mm-hmm. But that seems to be the focus of contemporary epistemology. The ancients would have thought that was a mundane and almost inconsequential matter. They would have thought that the point of epistemology would be to figure out how the different sciences vary from each other, say geometry from physics, physics from, say, ethics, ethics, and ultimately they would have thought that wisdom was required to be able to divide the sciences properly, and they would have also thought that each of those sciences would have a proper object, rather the way that, say, the sense of sight differs from the sense of hearing by having color as an object versus sound for the case of hearing. So too they thought that ethics differs from, say, physics, by ethics being concerned with what's to be done in this life towards realizing our ultimate end, versus studying how things move and what the causes of motion are, which is what physics would say.
If a person asks you, Dr. Noone, that I know God, what would be your response as a philosopher?
Well, I mean, I would, if they say they know that God exists, is that what you're saying?
Right,
or they know that God is just?
No,
or
I have this intimate relationship. I know God as I would know this table.
Right. That's a fairly rare claim in philosophy, actually.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Normally people deal with arguments for God's existence, right? And normally when someone says, I know that God exists, or that God is just, for example, or God is good, they would they would have in mind an argument that showed that God existed as the cause of the universe, say, or as the sort of thing that couldn't fail to exist because it's essentially God's essentially a necessary being. Now, what you're talking about is more, if you want, an acquaintance knowledge of God, right? And that's usually claimed by people, of course, who have or aren't usually doing philosophy, but rather doing are religious persons or mystics, and they claim some kind of direct awareness.
We know them.
Yeah,
we see them every day.
Yeah, so this is a sort of different
thing. Sometimes they run for president.
Mind you, philosophers do study mystical experience and or claim that kind of claims a religious knowledge, but in the branch of philosophy called philosophy of religion, that there's an epistemological aspect to it, to be sure, because you have to ask questions about, well, what kind of knowledge is religious knowledge versus, and in fact a great deal of modern epistemology, although most modern philosophers are unaware of this, comes out of precisely this effort to distinguish religious knowledge from philosophy, right, in the late Middle Ages.
Gotcha.
Yeah, that's where it actually comes from. So, for example, a lot of the funny thought experiments, both in modern contemporary thought, in early modern philosophy, Descartes, for example, are coming out of this theological background, strangely enough, where theologians would ask about, well, what if God only exercised his power and not his goodness and his wisdom? How bad could the situation get for us, given our native capacities? This starts to happen about the 14th century and becomes a topic in the 15th and 16th centuries thematically. And that, of course, would have been the background proximately for Descartes and almost all the early modern philosophers.
I see. So the start of modern philosophy starts with answering this relationship between what we're thinking and God.
But the interesting and odd thing is that all the theologians involved in that discussion in the Middle Ages thought that was properly a theological and not at all a philosophical problem. And many of them were philosophers, and they would think that you couldn't know that that was even a reasonable problem to pose, based just on what you would know from your ordinary experience.
Yes,
it was a purely theological problem.
What separates it then? I'm just curious. What separates? I mean, what I hear you saying is that this philosophy we were having philosophical discussions within a religious community, essentially, and it was essentially a religious question and answer that they were giving.
That's right.
But we eventually start separating it out and make philosophy as a science or near science, or related to science, and religion is another thing.
Right, that's right.
When did
that
happen?
begins in the 17th century, roughly at the time of late 16th, early 17th century. The key figure is Descartes.
I see.
Yeah, very clearly Descartes.
Yeah,
right?
so
who wished actually quite clearly in the Discourse on Method to to separate science and philosophy from religion or even traditional philosophy.
Yes.
And he very self-consciously proposes and to his satisfaction executes the program along those lines.
The discourse,
Yeah.
Interesting. Now, what is necessary and sufficient conditions for knowledge? What is the environment that knowledge happens in?
Well, I mean, in the traditional the standard analysis nowadays, the idea is that you would articulate these conditions of evidence or reliability, and then they would be, on the one hand, you would have to know the proposition in the sense of believe it. You would have to, the proposition would have to be true, and then you would have this justificatory element, this element of reliabilism or evidentialism that would warrant that belief, right? And that's the idea.
For example, 2 + 2 is 4.
Right, but that's a higher level proposition that's usually considered. The usual problem considered, for example, is say we're going down the road, you and I, we're taking a trip on Sunday, say, or Sunday drive, and we're passing, it's a rural road, it's a 2-lane road, and we're passing a bunch of barns, or so we think. And there are a bunch of barns. It's called the Gautier problem, right? So they're all on the right side, say, and we're going by, and we say, oh, there's a barn, there's another barn, there's another barn. Now we happen to stop at just one barn, and you say, this is a barn, and it's because it presents itself as a barn, right? Now it turns out on this particular example, you're correct. We walk all the way around that one, and sure enough, it's a barn, right? Now, however, it turns out we all assented. You and I both assented to those 20 other barns all being barns, and it turns out they're not barns. They're they're like props in a circuit. You know, it was just the front. They're all barn. All the other ones are barn facades. Right. So Gautier proposed this as a real problem for both sides, right? If you say, what was the evidence we had as we looked out of the car windows that warranted our belief that's a barn, right? Looks like we had the same evidence for when we first came up to this last one, and we stopped, right, and said that's a barn. We had the same evidence as it were all the other cases. So it looks like here we have a case where the evidence condition doesn't actually warrant the belief in the other 19 or 20 cases. And then likewise, reliabilism seems to be called into question because it was after all our senses or the causal processes of our senses that relied on the other 19 or 20 cases. So too do we rely on this case. In this case, we've got in this case it is knowledge, in other cases it wasn't knowledge.
It was accident.
So right, so the idea is that Gautier is posing this problem. The idea is that it's a problem for either of these theories is problematic, right? This is the idea. That reliabilism taken by itself is not sufficient and evidentialism isn't sufficient. This is because of this difficulty.
Yes. So you can't rely on your senses all the time.
Right. I mean, so usually the philosophical response to that is you can, assuming they're operating normally. And then, of course, another kind of corollary or addendum is, yes, in those other cases, you just weren't, as it were, sufficiently prudent in how you exercised. You know, you should have walked around all the other barns before you made the judgment, that's a barn.
Yes.
Okay, right. So that's the idea, is that, you know, if you were sufficiently astute and disciplined as an inquirer, you wouldn't have assented to the proposition that's a barn the other 19 or 20 times. That's the claim, right? So
I like to get your answer to a question that comes up in my interfaith circles a lot. We have 3 presenters from the Abrahamic traditions. You know what I'm talking about: Judaism, Christianity, Islam. They both declare that they have the truth, right? How, with knowledge of epistemology, would we actually resolve that issue? I mean, should we say they're all true, or they're all wrong, or they all do not know?
Right. This is a very difficult case, because here you have partly overlapping and partly conflicting beliefs, right? Yeah. And it's clear that if the principles of logic are going to hold, identity, for example, and bivalence, right? Proposition can't be, you can't have, you know, the principle of non-contradiction, principle of identity, principle of bivalence, those 3. If they're going to hold, then of course you can't have the conflicting places. Both parties can't be right.
Right.
Mind you, it's possible both logically and philosophically that there's some third proposition that's, as it were, covering both those that could be right. Right. But the respects in which they're contradictory would be problematic, right?
Yes,
that's right.
Yes, sir.
So,
your question, or the question that we have in front of us, that what makes justified belief, and I think you have actually answered that, but expand the idea. What justifies one's belief?
Well, again, in the contemporary situation, the idea is that and these are the people who tend to be what are called externalists. In other words, the idea is there's a causal process that's produced my belief. It's a reliable causal process, right? It begins with causal factors out there in the world. It interacts with me and produces my belief, which is kind of a natural, if you want, outcome of this process.
Yeah.
And because those processes are reliable, right? The claim is not that they're indefeasible, right, but that they're reliable.
Yeah.
Okay, so the idea is, in other words, yes, on an odd occasion when if the sun's at a very strange angle, I may believe that that's actually, a pink flower when in fact it's a yellow flower, right? Okay, so light rays can be bent a certain way. Okay, we could come up with lots of counterexamples, but the idea is that for the reliabilists is that for the most part these are reliable causal processes. So you're justified because of the reliability of those processes in endorsing, if you want, the product of those processes. Gotcha. That's the idea, right? The evidence people will come back to that, say, no, it's not really the causal process that matters, but rather the evidence as it's presented to your, and they're always thinking of a sense, the sense base. It's the evidence that the senses present that warrants the belief. Now I'm thinking way back to a man I work on a great deal on, John Duns Scotus. He, of course, as reliable as evidentialism was far in the future, but he tried to give, I think, a pretty interesting example of this last claim. How could it be, in other words, that the causal process can be, as it were, indeterminate, or at least not relevant to the consideration of whether something counts as knowledge. Scotus is arguing against another philosopher named Henry of Ghent. And Henry says that if you didn't have divine illumination, if God didn't illuminate your mind, you might well believe things which were truth-like but weren't really true, right?
Yes.
And Scotus tries to argue, no, depending what you want to count as a case of knowledge, and the case under discussion is every whole is greater than its parts.
Yes.
Scotus argues, well, let's just stipulate that in the discussion he says, let's just stipulate that everything that's produced my concept of white has been a black thing, really, although I haven't been aware of it. And everything that produced my concept of white has actually been a black thing. And let's stipulate that everything that produced my concept of part was actually a whole. And let's stipulate that everything that produced my concept of whole was a part. His point is, once I have, however, the notion or the concept whole and part, I know every whole is greater than its parts. And I know that no matter what the causal process was that led me to get whole and part. So even if the causal process was, as it were, indeterminate, or I couldn't analyze whether it was reliable or not, Scotus's argument is, once you have the notion of whole and part, that's necessary and sufficient to know this proposition. Every whole is greater than its parts, because that's what whole and part mean. So once you have those meanings, you can know every whole is greater than its parts, even if it turns out that there was a completely non-reliable, or at least an indeterminate process that led to that. So it's very, I think his examples,
solid.
Yeah, pretty interesting counterexample. And of course there he's dealing with the possibility of radical skepticism. And he's trying to say, well, once you have that kind of what they think, the medieval man would have thought that was a per se known proposition. It was a proposition that's known from the meaning of its terms. Then if you just subjoin some relevant other term, you could get a piece of knowledge. So for example, if it said every whole is greater than its parts, a house is a whole, therefore a house is greater than its parts, they would think that that was an instance of knowledge, that the proposition a house is greater than its parts can be known from, as a deduction. Right? So now you have a piece of knowledge. See, and I got all that, even though I couldn't give you an account of how reliable or unreliable the causal process to the formation of the concepts was.
Interesting.
Yeah, so that's a medieval example of
that's
the sort
medieval.
Of thing. Yeah. So they did actually, what's remarkable about the Middle Ages is they went through a lot of this stuff before, except regarding very high level materials.
That's when I started off the program by quoting Aristotle. I'm curious about your definition of Epirus Ism. I know it's not on our chart, but to get here, I had to divide empiricism from rationalism, and I wanted to get your definitions on it.
On which now? I'm sorry. On empiricism?
On empiricism and rationalism. What is the difference?
Right. This is again. This is actually behind much of contemporary epistemology. This divide goes back into the 17th and into the 18th centuries. The empiricists are defined over and against the rationalists. The empiricists are claiming that all our knowledge ultimately goes back to sense perception, directly or indirectly, possibly in some cases, some authors, through a very complicated process. In other authors, it's a fairly simple process. But no matter, all our knowledge, however intellectual, goes back there, and there's no knowledge that's acquired by us in the present conditions, which isn't ultimately sense-based knowledge. By contrast, the rationalists, Descartes would be a classic case, claim that there are pieces of knowledge which are either impressed on the mind at its creation or somehow innate. Others would claim make other claims, such as Kant would claim that no, it's not impressed knowledge. It's not innate ideas. It's rather the categories, the structure of the mind that's a given in the mind that gives us these propositions which would be true no matter what. And they are the basis for all knowledge, and what you learn from the senses has measured against them or somehow correlated with them to generate, say, physics as we have it. And of course, this was the great dialectic of modern philosophy. The rationalists were historically just a little earlier, but the great empiricists came along, and then you have this long set of discussions that ultimately terminates in Kant and Hegel.
Interesting.
Yeah. So,
how long the evolution of the study of knowledge has gone on? I mean, it's like.
Well, I mean, I would. You could say, of course, that the epistemology goes back at least as far as the generation of Heraclitus and Parmenides, but quite clearly we don't have anything really worked out very well until you get to the generation of Socrates and Plato.
And just in closing, the modern use of epistemology can be used to analyze things well. What I'm thinking of is that we have such a barrage of data that's coming at us. How can epistemology, the study of epistemology, will help us to sort through this huge mountain of information?
Well, what it does is sharpens one's focus on what's going to count as evidence, and what's going to count as a reliable process. So you find this in computers all the time, right? The process of transferring the data might be very unreliable.
Yes, right.
So, and so the evidence the data suggests might be fairly strong, but if it's an effective process, you might want to question how strong that evidence is, right?
Yes.
Right. And this happens a lot, I think, especially with computers.
Yes. I've had that experience. In parting, what is a good book that a person who's interested mildly in epistemology that a student might read?
Well, there's some very good books in contemporary, but I think a basic primer could be Keith Lehrer's book Epistemology, published I think in 1990. And then for ancient epistemology, I recommend this book by Lord Gerson, Ancient Epistemology. Just came out a few years ago. It's very well written, very clearly written, very simple, and it tries to articulate precisely some of the things I was saying tonight, the difference between ancient and medieval ways of thinking about epistemology and modern ones. And he's actually defending the ancient one as being, if anything, preferable to the modern one. So
there are the people who do say that in modern times we chop it up too finely. And the ancients would deal with it as a whole.
Right. That's exactly. That's his position.
Yeah.
It's more or less similar to my own position.
Yeah. which makes sense. Thanks, Professor Noone,
my pleasure.
for coming by,
Thank you.
And we'll get you back.
Thank you.
We've been talking to Professor Timothy B. Noone from the Catholic University of America School of Philosophy about epistemology, the nature and scope of knowledge. If you want to know more about the Scholars Chair program, go to YouTube or go to Read One channel on YouTube, or follow us on Twitter and Facebook. If you'd like to email us, you can do so at scholarschair@gmail.com. I am Khalil Jadid. Good night.
Hit it.
Amazing.
As a parent, I think it's tragic that 1 in 5 children struggles with hunger right here in America. But there is hope. Visit feedingamerica.org to help. Together we can solve hunger. Together we're feeding America.